Seattle, 1958. Parker Cook had been teaching music at Garfield High School for 30 years. He knew what talent looked like. He knew what it sounded like. He'd sat across from hundreds of students over the decades, watched their fingers find wrong notes, watched their faces fall when the sound didn't match what they had in their heads. He'd learned through all of it to tell the truth early, kindly but clearly. There was no cruelty in honesty. There was more cruelty, he believed, in letting a kid waste years on a dream that wasn't going anywhere. That autumn, a 15-year-old named Jimi Hendrix started bringing a guitar to school. He carried it through the hallways of Garfield in a beat-up case that had seen better days. The kind of case that looked like it had been dropped from a moving vehicle at least once. Jimmy was thin, quiet, wore clothes that didn't always fit quite right. He came from the Central District, the part of Seattle where money was never comfortable. His father, Al, had picked up the guitar for him from a friend who was done with it. $5, a used acoustic, nothing special. But the way Jimmy carried it, you'd have thought it was something irreplaceable. Cook noticed him one afternoon in the music room. The other students had already left. Jimmy had come in, settled into a chair in the corner, and started playing. The guitar was strung upside down. Cook stood in the doorway for a moment without saying anything. Jimmy had the instrument flipped, the body resting against his right side, the neck pointing left, his left hand moving across the strings with a steadiness that didn't look learned. He was a left-hander playing a right-handed guitar in reverse. The configuration looked almost wrong to Cook's trained eye, like watching someone write with the wrong hand and somehow produce clean letters anyway. But Jimmy didn't seem to notice anything unusual about it. He just played. Cook stepped into the room. Jimmy looked up and stopped. "You play often?" Cook asked. "Every day," Jimmy said. Cook pulled a chair close and sat down. He listened for a few minutes. The boy had something, an instinct, an ear, the kind of feel that some students never develop no matter how long they practiced. But there were gaps, technical gaps. His chord transitions were rough in places. He was teaching himself entirely by ear, copying what he heard on records his father played, Muddy Waters, Robert Johnson, B.B. King, and it showed. There was no structure underneath, no formal understanding of what he was doing or why it worked when it did. When Jimmy finished, Cook was quiet for a moment. "You ever taken lessons?" he asked. Jimmy shook his head. "It shows," Cook said. He meant it as an observation, not a wound. "You have feeling. That's not nothing, but feeling on its own only goes so far. Technique matters. Theory matters. Without them, you're just wandering." He paused. "Have you thought about other things? Things you might build a real future around?" Jimmy looked at him. He didn't answer right away. He looked at Cook the way teenagers sometimes do when they're deciding whether the adult in front of them is worth explaining something to. "I play every day," he said finally, quietly, not defiant, just a fact. Cook nodded slowly. He'd heard that before. The dedication was real. He could see it. But dedication wasn't the same as direction. Some kids played every day for years and arrived nowhere. Practice without a foundation was just stubbornness with a guitar attached. "Think about it," Cook said, and stood up. "There are other paths." He left the room. Jimmy was still sitting in the corner with the upside-down guitar when the door closed behind him. That winter, Jimmy kept appearing in the music room after hours. Not every day, but enough that Cook started expecting to see the beat-up case leaning against the wall near the door. Sometimes Cook would stop and listen for a minute before moving on to wherever he was going. The boy was getting better, no question about that. But Cook had watched students improve before. Improvement wasn't evidence of a ceiling being raised. Improvement just meant someone was putting in time. Everyone put in time. Not everyone arrived somewhere worth arriving. By the following year, word got around that Jimmy was playing in small bands around Seattle. Teen dances, local clubs, the kind of gigs that paid almost nothing and ended when the neighbors started calling. Cook heard about it from other students. He didn't follow up on it. He had 30 other students and a program to run, and the details of Jimi Hendrix's weekend gigs weren't something he spent energy on. In October 1960, Jimmy stopped coming to Garfield entirely. The school records showed a withdrawal. Cook heard through the faculty that the kid had dropped out. He didn't know the specifics, and truthfully, he didn't spend much time wondering about them. A 15-year-old who dropped out of high school to play guitar in Seattle bars was not, in Cook's experience, a story that ended particularly well. He moved on, the way teachers do. The years passed in the rhythm that school years always do. New faces every September, familiar routines, the same rooms smelling the same way in the same seasons. Cook taught his classes, he ran the music program, he told students the truth when they needed to hear it, even when it wasn't what they'd come looking for. He was honest. He'd always been honest. He believed that was what a good teacher did. He did not think about Jimi Hendrix. Not once in 7 years did the name surface in his mind. It was the spring of 1967 when he first saw it in print. A newspaper. Cook doesn't remember which one, whether it was the Seattle Times or something that had come in from out of town. What he remembers is the photograph. A young black man on a stage somewhere in London, a guitar held in his hands. The crowd behind him, a blur of raised arms and open mouths. The guitar was flipped, left-handed, strung backwards the way it would have to be for someone who played with their left hand and had figured out, on their own, how to make a right-handed instrument work in reverse. The name in the caption read, Jimi Hendrix. Cook stared at the photograph for a long time. He read the article slowly. The writing was the kind of breathless that music journalism gets when it encounters something it can't quite put into a sentence. The writer kept reaching for comparisons and coming up short. He described an audience in London that had gone completely still during a performance. Not the polite stillness of people being patient, but the involuntary stillness of people who have stopped being able to do anything except listen. He quoted other musicians, established musicians, saying things that musicians almost never say out loud about each other. That they had watched this guitarist and felt, for the first time, genuinely unsure of what they knew. Cook set the newspaper down on his kitchen table. Then he picked it up again. The guitar in the photograph was flipped the same way it had always been. Left hand moving across the strings, the same configuration he'd watched from the doorway of the Garfield music room 9 years ago, when he'd stood there for a moment thinking it looked almost wrong, like watching someone use the wrong hand and produce clean letters anyway. He thought about what he had said. There are other paths. The words sat in his chest in a way he hadn't expected. Not guilt, exactly. Something quieter than guilt, and harder to put a name to. He was a man who had spent 30 years making careful judgments about musical potential. He had looked at this particular 15-year-old and seen the gaps, the rough transitions, the missing theory, the self-taught ear working without a map. And he had missed what was underneath them. He'd heard the stumbles and not heard the instinct driving them. He'd told a kid who played every single day, without being asked to, without being paid to, without anyone telling him he should, he'd told that kid to think about something else. He hadn't been cruel. He'd been practical. He'd thought he was being kind. He sat at his kitchen table for a while without doing much of anything. By the end of 1967, Jimi Hendrix was everywhere. You couldn't open a music magazine without the name appearing somewhere. The reviews were the kind that made other artists uncomfortable to read. Not because they were unkind, but because they described something that sounded genuinely unrepeatable. A guitarist who had arrived at a language no one else was speaking, who played blues and rock, and something that didn't have a name yet, all through a guitar he held upside down and strung backwards, and played with his left hand, like it was the most natural configuration in the world. Cook read everything he could find. He didn't tell anyone he was doing it. He didn't mention to colleagues or students or anyone who passed through his classroom that he had once sat across from Jimi Hendrix in the Garfield music room and suggested he consider other paths. There was no version of that story that ended well for him, so he kept it to himself and read quietly and thought about what he had missed. He thought about the moment he had walked into the music room and seen the guitar flipped and thought it looked almost wrong. He thought about the boy who hadn't argued, hadn't defended himself, had just said, "I play every day," and looked at him with eyes that weren't asking for anything except maybe to be left alone to play. He thought about the assumption he'd made, that feeling without technique was a dead end, that instinct without structure was just wandering with a guitar, that a kid who couldn't yet do the things Cook could measure wasn't going to be able to do the things Cook couldn't. He thought about how completely, how quietly, how irreversibly wrong he had been. Parker Cook retired from Garfield High School in 1971 after more than 4 decades in the same building. By then, Jimi Hendrix had been dead for nearly a year. The news had come through in September 1970. A headline, a photograph, that guitar resting in a left hand that had, somewhere between Seattle and London, changed the sound of everything. Cook kept the newspaper from 1967, the first one. He'd folded it carefully and placed it somewhere he wouldn't lose it, which was unlike him. He wasn't a man who kept things. No one who knew him ever fully understood why he kept that particular piece of paper. He never explained it to anyone. Some things you carry because they remind you of what you got right, and some things you carry because they remind you of the day you sat across from something extraordinary, opened your mouth with the best intentions, and said the wrong thing so completely that no version of going back could ever fix it. Jimi Hendrix never looked for another path. He went deeper into the only one he had. He played every day exactly like he said. Through the teen dances in Seattle and the years he spent barely getting by, and the Army base in Kentucky, and the bars of Nashville and the clubs of New York, and eventually the stages of London. Through all of it, he played. And somewhere in that time, the gaps that Cook had noticed closed themselves. Not because someone showed him the way, because he kept playing until the music worked out what it was trying to say. The guitar was always upside down, the left hand always moving, the same as it had been in that quiet room at Garfield after school, when a 15-year-old boy sat in the corner and played for no one in particular, just because it was the only thing he had ever wanted to do, and he could not imagine doing anything else.